Yeah, so a federal judge in Rhode Island who had previously issued what's called a temporary restraining order, telling the Trump administration that it must lift the freeze on the billions of dollars in federal funding that had been allocated to the states. So after that order had been issued, the Trump administration had some time to comply and lift the freeze. And just today, Brian, we got another court order. It looks like the Trump administration has not complied with that temporary restraining order. So the 22 state attorneys general went back into court and sought a motion to enforce the judge's earlier order. But really, the blockbuster news is this is the first time a federal court judge has issued a ruling, a finding that the Trump administration is violating a federal court order. The judge is Judge John J. McConnell Jr. And Brian, he didn't mince any words because right in the opening salvo of today's order, he said, it's a basic proposition that all orders and judgments of courts must be complied with promptly. The judge put all of that in bold print, which you don't often see in
Yeah.
court orders. Persons who make private determinations of the law and refuse to obey an order generally risk criminal contempt. That is a shot across the bow. Now, it's important to note that the judge did not hold the Trump administration or any official in contempt today, nor did he impose any sanctions, any fines. But it sounds like when Judge McConnell is opening with, y'all are running the risk of criminal contempt, which can include punishment, including confinement. You know, the Trump administration may want to think twice about whether they want to continue to violate court orders.
Okay, so Glenn, the judge didn't hold these people in contempt, even though they're flouting the orders that were handed down by the court. Why not? I mean, we have seen, not just from this administration in the last couple of weeks, but Donald Trump in the last few years continue to flout these orders, knowing full well that he can continue to bank off of the goodwill of these judges. And yet, it seems that the justice system, that the judicial system isn't learning its lesson, that Trump isn't interested in deferring to the law, that he's going to continue to take every inch he can get. And until these judges actually take swift and severe action against him, he'll continue to barrel ahead. And so why not just learn the lessons from the past, hold these people in contempt if you're already seeing that they're willing to refuse to abide by the court orders that were handed down?
Yeah, here's why, Brian. In my 30 years being a federal prosecutor, handling, among other things, contempt charges and contempt cases, judges never, and I'm not even going to qualify that by saying almost never, judges never hold somebody in contempt for the first violation, the first transgression. What they do is they order them to comply. Now, when you read this very short court order issued today, the judge says, you know what? The Trump administration tried to say, well, we're just ferreting out fraud, waste, and abuse. And the judge
Yeah.
said, I didn't give you any kind of an exception that would give you an escape hatch like that. Also, the Trump administration tried to say, well, there was actually a different executive order issued, and that's why we did or didn't do certain things. The judge was having none of it. So basically, you know, you usually get one bite at the violating a court order apple before judges start to get serious. So now the judge will have to monitor this order now that he's ordered them to comply to see if in fact they continue to defy the order or if they comply. And if they continue to defy, I can almost promise you the next thing you're going to see are what are called show cause hearings. You, Donald Trump, and your administration must show cause as to why I shouldn't hold you in contempt because you've been warned once. And then there are different kinds of contempt. They can proceed with civil contempt, which is really more about fines, or they can go to criminal contempt, which can include actually detaining, confining, jailing administration officials. But let me tell you, if the judge decides to go the way of criminal contempt, there will be some more criminal contempt hearings because then the person who is at risk of being confined has some due process rights and there will be a hearing conducted. So listen, this is not something that ever happens instantly. It usually doesn't happen, you know, the first time there is a violation of the court order. It builds over time, but I think this one is going to build and come to a head pretty quickly.
Well, Glenn, let's game this out for a moment, and let's say, for example, that a judge does decide to try and hold an administration official under criminal contempt. Ultimately, it would be under the purview of the U.S. Marshals to actually enforce that. But aren't these U.S. Marshals under the purview of the DOJ? And so you'd have the administration would be responsible for enforcing criminal action against other administration officials, which clearly they would have no interest in doing?
Yeah, Brian, that's the perfect question because that is exactly where the rubber meets the road. Let's assume that after a hearing, the judge finds that a particular Trump administration official is in criminal contempt, knowingly, intentionally, and repeatedly violating court orders. What happens next? Well, it would be the United States Marshal Service that would be responsible for example, hauling that official into court and executing a court order to take that official into custody and put them in a Federal Bureau of Prisons facility. And people will say, well, wait a minute, because the U.S. Marshal Service is part of the Department of Justice and ultimately controlled by who? Donald Trump. Wouldn't he just tell them not to comply? He can try. But here's the thing, Brian, there's a federal law that sets out the responsibilities of the U.S. Marshal Service. Anybody scoring at home, it's 28 United States Code Section 566. And here's what it says. It is the primary role and mission of the United States Marshal Service to provide security for federal judges and to obey, execute, and enforce all orders of the United States District Courts. What does that mean? That means that the U.S. Marshal Service is obligated by federal law to enforce court orders. And here's the thing, Brian, we are getting closer and closer to a true constitutional crisis when the executive branch of government says, even though we are duty bound by our constitutional construct to comply with lawfully issued federal court orders, we're not doing it. Then the United States Marshal Service has a decision to make, and I don't believe it's a difficult decision. Let me say, I worked with the good men and women of the U.S. Marshal Service for decades. They take their responsibility and their loyalty to the Constitution deadly seriously. And I think the success of Donald Trump attempting to plunge us into a constitutional crisis depends on just how many people Donald Trump can recruit to his what is a de facto criminal conspiracy to undermine the laws of our nation and to undermine the Constitution. I do not believe, and I hope I'm not being naive about this, that the men and women of the U.S. Marshal Service will say, we're going to violate the federal law that requires us to execute lawfully issued federal court orders by federal court judges. Instead, we're going to walk away from the Constitution and from our legal obligations, and we're going to side with a corrupt president. I am looking for the U.S. Marshals Service to stand strong against crime, corruption, and unconstitutional behavior and execute court orders by federal court judges.
Well, Glenn, here's my pushback to that, and I hope I'm not being too cynical here, although there's a low bar for how cynical we could be these days. But hearing that it's unlikely to see the U.S. Marshal Service do something illegal. I mean, at the same time, we're also talking about them reacting to the prospect of the situation that we are currently in, which is that Donald Trump his administration was ordered to do something. He refused to comply with a lawful order handed down by a judge, and so that's why we're in this situation. We're already in a situation where the federal government isn't following the law. And so that's why it's difficult for me to see that and say, okay, well, we couldn't possibly see a situation where somebody would, in the federal government would defy the law because we're this whole thought experiment is in response to the Trump administration already doing exactly that.
Yeah, the Trump administration is acting lawlessly. Indeed, it's acting unconstitutionally when, for example, Donald Trump signs an executive order revoking the constitutional right of birthright citizenship. And a Reagan-appointed judge who's been on the bench for 4 decades said, and I quote, "It is blatantly unconstitutional," that executive order. So we see the executive branch acting lawlessly and unconstitutionally. We see Congress, the Republicans in Congress, just laying down for Donald Trump and acting as his doormat. They're not, asserting themselves. They're not protecting their own rights and interests as a co-equal branch of government. So what's to say the United States Marshal Service will do any better? All I can say is, having worked with those men and women, I expect them to do better. It doesn't mean that they may go the way of the Republicans in Congress and the Trump administration. I just hope and believe they won't go that way until they do. And then, Brian, basically the executive branch has co-opted all three branches of government, because if the judiciary cannot rely on the law that mandates that their orders must be executed and complied with, if we can't rely on that, well, then Trump has successfully co-opted all branches of government, and then welcome to the American dictatorship.
Well, look, I do want to note to that exact point that political gravity does exist, and I think that it is important that we call this stuff out as it happens so that people can be aware of it, push back on it, and we've seen the Trump administration relent before when political gravity becomes too great. So we'll continue to follow up on this stuff as soon as we have any updates. For those who are watching right now, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.